Everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. As people are entering the meeting, I'd like to ask you to do me a favor. Can you type in the chat where you're joining us from and what your affiliation is? We'd like to know who's with us tonight. So I have two screens, so if you see me looking back and forth, it's not because I'm not interested in what we're doing, but I have two screens. So in your chat box, if you could go ahead and type in your name and where you're joining us from and your affiliation. So by way of housekeeping, first I want to say thank you for joining us for Real Talk, the COVID vaccine myths and facts discussion. Next slide, Craig. By way of housekeeping, all of your lines are muted. We encourage that you ask questions throughout the presentation. Even if you believe that the question will be answered during the presentation, please ask it. We want to provide as much information as we can in the allotted time. To ask a question, you can go ahead and just type it in the chat. This evening is going to be recorded, and the link will be shared following the meeting. Before we go any further, I want to take a moment and acknowledge our partners. I want to thank the Theta Zeta Lambda chapter of Alpha Phi Alpha Fraternity Incorporated, as well as the Detroit and Connecticut chapters for the National Association of Health Service Executives. Next slide. By way of introduction, my name is LaRonda Chastain, and I serve as the Vice President for Diversity and Inclusion at Trinity Health. Trinity Health is one of the largest Catholic health delivery systems in the nation, serving a diverse community that includes more than 30 million people across 22 states. Trinity Health includes 92 hospitals, as well as 100 continuing care locations that include PACE programs, senior living facilities, and home care and hospice services. We serve in the spirit of the gospel as a compassionate, transforming, healing presence in our communities. Now, we are here tonight because we know that communities of color have been experiencing the overwhelming weight of COVID-19. We understand and acknowledge the reasons that many of us are reluctant to be vaccinated. Tonight, our hope is to provide the facts about the COVID-19 vaccine and address some common myths and provide an opportunity to ask questions. Tonight, our speakers are Dr. Reggie Eady. He is the president and CEO of Trinity Health of New England. He's an emergency medicine physician, and he co-chairs the governor of Connecticut's Vaccine Advisory Group. We also have Muriel Bean. She serves as Senior Vice President and Chief Informatics Officer for Trinity Health and has been helping to lead Trinity Health's vaccine operations. Next slide. Before I turn the mic over to Reggie, I'd like to start with a quick poll. While the poll is coming up, you should now notice it in your right-hand side of your screen. And so if you would, please answer the poll question. And it states, based on what you know right now, how likely are you to get the COVID vaccine? And the scale is very unlikely, somewhat unlikely, somewhat likely, very likely, and I got my shot already. So just based on what you know today, how likely are you to get the COVID-19 vaccine? Let me answer the poll myself. All right, so as you all are answering that poll question, I want to invite Dr. Eady to be prepared because our poll will be closing in just a few seconds. And Craig, once that time ends, you can go ahead and display the answers. Okay, so we're all over the board. We see several people have gotten the shot. I want to capture that. All right, Dr. Eady, it's yours.
Thank you. So first of all, it's a pleasure and honor to be in front of all of you today. These are unprecedented and difficult times, and so I think it's important that you had the courage to free your evening up to have a short conversation around a very important subject matter. Before I jump in, though, I just wanted to make one point. Today's event or conversation is not intended to persuade you in any direction around the vaccine and your decision to take the vaccine. You know, I'm reminded of a scripture that comes out of Hosea 4:6 that says, "My people perish because of the lack of knowledge, because they rejected the knowledge." And so again, I applaud you for taking the time to expose yourself to hardcore facts about the vaccine. Listen for three things today. One is going to be on vaccine efficacy. The second is going to be on the safety of the vaccine. And then the third is going to be on the quality of the vaccine. So without further ado, why don't we get started? You know, 2020 is going to go down in history, unfortunately, as one of the most deadly years in American history. When you think about the 3,000 to 4,000 people that die every single day in this country, I don't know about you, but I'm sure everyone in the audience either has heard of someone or knows someone, whether it's a friend or a family, who succumbed to this pandemic that has untoward outcomes for many of us. What keeps a smile on my face, though, is that I am blessed enough to work for a company, Trinity Health, where on any given day, over 2,000 patients are being cared for who have COVID. That's who we are, and as LaRonda suggested, that's what we do every single day. But this is just the beginning. This is just the beginning of our transition out of this pandemic. You know, as Dr. Fauci predicted after Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Christmas, New Year's and New Year's Eve celebrations, Three Kings Day, that because families find it difficult for them to stay separate, we predicted there would be resurgences throughout the country from an infectivity perspective of COVID-19. And lo and behold, over the last 2 weeks, we've seen more than 10% increase in hospitalization providing COVID care. So let's talk about a couple things. So how did the vaccine get approved? It's a routine process that all manufacturers of such drugs have to get approval from the Federal Drug Administration as well as the CDC. And so you will recall in conversations or things that you've heard or read that both Pfizer and Moderna, the two that we have here in our country today, started producing this vaccine obviously prior to getting approval. What they asked for was emergency use authorization. The way that works is, and again, you have probably heard and read about this, but both Pfizer and then subsequently Moderna, Pfizer was first, took what we call an RNA technology, which I'll talk about in just a second, something that they had been using years prior to the onset of the pandemic. They stopped the line, transferred that technology in the midst of the pandemic to creating a vaccine for COVID-19. They went through their preclinical trials. Preclinical refers to animals like the mouse or a chimpanzee. They then went next to their phase 1 clinical trials. Clinical versus preclinical, the clinical references humans, which phase 1 had less than 100 people. Phase 2 clinical trial, which had hundreds of people. And then they went to phase 3 clinical trial, which had thousands of people. In fact, almost 80,000 people or more have participated in the clinical trials for both Pfizer and Moderna. And once they completed the phase 3 of the clinical trial, they then applied to the Federal Drug Administration for emergency use authorization. Please note that this is not the normal authorization. They will still have to go back and get that. But this, for the most part, focuses on the efficacy, the quality, and the safety, there are those three again, of the vaccine. The advisory committee, a group of experts, then reviewed the information or the data that both Pfizer and Moderna submitted to the FDA, and then they gave a thumbs up for both of their research and advised the FDA to move forward with approval. The FDA then engages the CDC or the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, ACIP, for them to weigh in. They too gave the thumbs up and then provided recommendations on who should participate in the phases as we roll out the vaccine initiative. So that is the typical process, and I'm addressing that because many times people are concerned or ask questions about the approval process. So just how well does the vaccine work? So we're talking about the effectiveness of the vaccine. You often hear a fancy word called efficacy. Efficacy essentially is the ability for this initiative to produce the desired outcomes. Now, which desired outcomes are we concerned about in the midst of the pandemic? Of course, it's immunity, because we know that if we reach a certain degree of immunity, it will decrease both morbidity and mortality. And then we are on our way to what we call herd immunity, which I'll talk about in just a second. But from an efficacy perspective, you probably already know how excited we are that Pfizer's vaccine has an efficacy of 95%. Moderna, which also uses the same mRNA technology, has an efficacy of about 94.5%. So they're both well appreciated efficacies. Recall that Dr. Fauci said early on in the pandemic, if we could only get a vaccine that had an efficacy of about 50%, and he was alluding or comparing to the influenza or the flu vaccine, we'd be in a good spot. The flu vaccine, as a reminder, is anywhere between 40 and 60 in efficacy. On average, it's about 50%. And here we are sitting today with Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines that well exceed Dr. Fauci's expectations, as well as the efficacy of the influenza vaccine. So I thought I'd just take a very short moment to compare and contrast at least two, if not three, the vaccines. One, we have Pfizer. Two, we have Moderna. And then shortly after, we think within the next few months, we'll have one from Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca. So let's just do a quick comparison and contrast. Let me orient you to the slide. The purple chart on top, first column are the characteristics of each of the vaccines. The second is the Pfizer vaccine. The third, Moderna. And then the fourth is AstraZeneca. And as you see, as we look at the second row, both Pfizer and Moderna, as I indicated, are based on RNA technology. Interestingly, AstraZeneca, when that becomes available, unless something changes, they are using the RNA technology, but they're combining it with a live attenuated adenovirus. We'll talk about that in just a second. But suffice it to say, the adenovirus is what causes the common cold in humans. Look at the doses. So Pfizer, you take 2 shots 21 days apart, Moderna 2 28 days apart, and AstraZeneca 2 30 days apart. And then there's the efficacy, which we just talked about. The efficacy for Pfizer 95, Moderna 94, and AstraZeneca on average is about 70%, all of which exceed Dr. Fauci's expectations. And then, of course, you see in the next row that they all are based on the spike protein. Now, it's often brought to our attention that, wow, there are 2 injections. Is that novel? Is that something we should be concerned about? And then the fact that AstraZeneca uses a live but attenuated virus, how about that in our conversations? So let me draw your attention to the bottom of the screen, the green chart, just to answer those questions. The second column here is the flu vaccine, and the third is measles, mumps, and rubella. And look at the differences between Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca, flu, and measles, mumps, and measles, mumps, and rubella. As you see, the flu vaccine, which I took in early September, is a live but inactivated virus or vaccine. So it's a live vaccine that they inactivated, and then they injected into my arm a few months ago. You see it's an annual administration, and you see the efficacy, as I alluded to earlier, is about 50%. Next to that is the measles, mumps, and rubella. Now look at this. It's a live attenuated virus, which is similar to AstraZeneca minus the RNA technology that was added to it. And just like Moderna, it's 2 shots, 28 days apart, and luckily the efficacy for measles, mumps, and rubella, which is why none of us are seeing or have to worry about, for the most part, measles, mumps, and rubella, because the efficacy was at 97%. So that gives you an idea of what we're dealing with when we go back up to the purple chart, looking at the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, which, again, as you know, are available for you in your state. One more point I want to make, efficacy not being 100% suggests that there's still a small percentage of people who can actually succumb to the disease. The good news is sits in that right circle, purple circle in the right lower quadrant of your slide, and that is that of all the people that participated in the Pfizer and Moderna clinical trials, The question is, how many of them got so sick where they need to be hospitalized, or how many of them still got the virus and died? And the answer, ladies and gentlemen, is 0. None of them needed hospitalization, and none of them actually got so sick that they died. So to me, I think this is impelling evidence that, at least for this point through the presentation, that it looks like that this is a good way to address or transition out of this pandemic. I'm often asked about Pfizer and who was in the denominator or who participated in the research. And so I pulled this from the Pfizer website, which shows me that almost half were females. And I think that's important because we begin to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, well, where do I fall in that research as we ask ourselves questions around quality, safety, and efficacy. As you see, about 9% were of the African-American background. Almost a quarter, or just over a quarter of them, were from the Latinx community. The average age that participated in Pfizer's study was 51. And then remember early on in the pandemic when people were saying that if you're obese, if you're a cigarette smoker, if you have an immunocompromised diagnosis like diabetes, or you have chronic known lung disease, then those people don't do good. So Pfizer took it upon themselves to include 35% of their research population to be obese. Just over 8% had diabetes, and almost 8% had known chronic lung disease. So I think this is a good sample. I think they included, at least from my personal experience, enough of a diverse group of people to extrapolate that that the studies and the results of the studies, i.e. the efficacy, is ideal for all populations in our country. Now, this is another slide I got from Pfizer. Again, the overall efficacy is 95%. But when you look down in the subgroups of those that participated in the research, and forgive me, my circle is covering up one of the results, but we see vaccine hesitancy more prominent in Black and brown communities. And so the question is always asked, well, how did people from the Latinx and African-American community pan out after they received the vaccine during the study? Well, according to Pfizer, not me, not Trinity Health, but Pfizer, the efficacy for Blacks and people from the Latinx community are 100% and 94.4% respectively. So that reassured me tremendously and gave me the courage and the comfort to get in front of brown and Black people and explain to them what I consider to be such good news. And then there's herd immunity. So herd immunity, by definition, is when the majority of people in an environment, so it can be in your household, it could be in a community, your city, your county, your state, or the nation, or as far as the globe, when the majority of them have reached immunity in some form or fashion and by whatever means necessary to a virus or disease. In this particular case, there are two ways, and I want you to get this point because this is important. There are two ways in the midst of this pandemic that we can reach herd immunity. One, it has to do with the narrative that we saw coming out of Washington, D.C., but one is that we just let everyone get exposed to it, and it'll just one day disappear. A couple things with that notion. One, it will take years before we reached herd immunity in that right. Two, with 3,000 to 4,000 people dying every single day, ladies and gentlemen, that probably is certainly not the way we want to go. The second choice or option to reach herd immunity is through vaccination. And we happen to believe that it's the safest way to do it. I personally believe it's the safest way to do it. And I will prove in just a second how safe I think it is. But let's keep talking about safety. When we entertain safety, the first thing that comes to mind oftentimes in conversation is Operation Warp Speed. In other words, how were the manufacturers able to produce this vaccine in such an abbreviated or short period of time without jeopardizing quality, safety, efficacy, or skipping any steps? So the so-called Operation Warp Speed is just this accelerated process to produce a vaccine. So let's talk about that for just a second. So first of all, the influenza vaccine took about 10 years to manufacture and get approved. On average, vaccines, according to my research, take about 6 years to produce. Now, we have had a vaccine in the United States available for inoculation or injection to the arms of our citizens in less than 12 months. I mean, if you consider the pandemic starting around March, and here it is February, here this January. We have not yet even reached the 12-month mark. But nonetheless, it's available. But how were they able to do it so quickly? Suffice it to say, in the normal process, which averages about 6 years, and again, the flu vaccine took about 10. In the normal process, they go by step-by-step process or in series. So in other words, they don't start phase 2 clinical trial until they're done with phase 1. They don't start phase 3 until they're done with phase 2. So again, step-by-step process in series. In this accelerated process, they did not skip steps. I want to be clear on that. But instead, what they did was they didn't do things in series or in step-by-step fashion. They did things in parallel. So they were doing, for example, clinical trial phase 1 and phase 2 at the same time. How is that possible? Well, because we're in the midst of a pandemic. And remember, clinical trial, phase 1 clinical trial means you have less than 100 people, clinical meaning humans. Phase 2 means you have thousands of people. In the midst of a pandemic, you can imagine that hundreds and thousands of people in a short period of time actually raised their hands and said, I'd be willing to participate, Pfizer and Moderna, in one of your research projects. So they could do phase 1 and phase 2 at the same time and then bring phase 3 in very quickly, again, without skipping any steps, and also without jeopardizing quality, safety, and efficacy. Is how they were able to produce the vaccine in such a short period of time. And I thought that was very important for you all to know. Another reason why there's some questions about the safety of this vaccine has to do with that RNA technology I alluded to earlier. So let's talk about that for just a second. So first of all, recap, the mRNA technology was being used by many scientists at that particular time prior to the pandemic. They were looking for a vaccine, for example, for cancer or a treatment for cancer. They stopped the line in the midst of the pandemic and shifted this technology to create a vaccine. So let's go down to the bottom left corner of this slide, and you see the illustration I had there that shows how you go from DNA to RNA and then RNA to a protein. And we're not going to go through protein synthesis, which happens in your cells continuously, but suffice it to say that DNA, you get half from your mother, half from your father, and that's your genetic code. Your RNA then has the responsibility of deciphering or interpreting the genetic code and following the instructions to produce something. So the RNA is a producer. It's an assembler. It does the work on behalf of the genetic code or your DNA. And once the RNA reads that genetic code, like an instruction manual, if you will, and produces, in this illustration, a protein, then its job is done. So let's go back to the slide here and look at the middle. Let's look at the spike protein diagram, which you have seen ad nauseum, I know. Well, the focus here is on the spike protein. Why? Because that's the first step in which the virus impacts a human cell. In other words, and in a very high and laymanized manner, if you can imagine that the spike protein and then the crown, hence the name crown virus, the spike protein which protrudes from the coronavirus, the function of this spike protein and its crown is to sort of grab onto human cells, punch holes into the human cells, and then it deposits its RNA into your cell. So it sort of hijacks your cell. Why does it do that? Well, it punches holes on the membranes of your cell and injects its RNA for one reason. That is because that entire RNA, now that you know what RNA does, it assembles, it creates or produces a product. What the coronavirus's RNA does inside of your cell is produce another coronavirus. So you go from one coronavirus to 2, 2 to 4, 4 to 8, 8 to 16, 16 to 32. If it impacts the cells responsible for your smell, you lose your smell. Your taste, you lose your taste. In your lungs, you go into what we call respiratory distress. Sometimes you need to be hospitalized. Sometimes you need to be placed on a ventilator. Sometimes you don't have a good outcome. Well, the way the vaccine works is taking that, what we just talked about, and what they did was they said to themselves, well, let's take a coronavirus, which they did. Let's open up the coronavirus, and let's pull out the RNA, the entire RNA. Remember, the entire RNA, when injected into human cells, will produce an entire coronavirus. But in this particular case, they said, well, let's just cut out the part of the RNA that's responsible for producing the spike protein. Why? Because that's the first step in the cell interacting with your cell, in the virus interacting with your cell. It attaches to your cells, punches holes, and deposits the RNA. So when they remove the RNA that's only responsible, not the whole RNA, so you can't get coronavirus from the vaccine, just the part of RNA that's responsible for producing the spike protein. They inject that into humans, and it goes through the same process that we talked about before. So now, inside of your human cells, it's not producing the whole coronavirus, it's only producing the spike protein. When the spike protein is produced, like that protein on the bottom left corner, when it's produced and dumped into your bloodstream, your brain sees that as a foreign object, and it begins to make what we call antibodies. So now we're on the third picture. It makes antibodies to the spike protein. So now you have antibodies in your blood so that when or if you are exposed to coronavirus, when the coronavirus's spike protein tries to attach to your cell to punch holes and deposits RNA, your antibodies say, stop. You cannot attach to the cell. You cannot infect me. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how the vaccine works. The RNA technology is what we just explained, which hopefully you completely understand. And if you look at that diagram on the left lower quadrant again, you'll see that there are no arrows going from the protein to the RNA to the DNA. It's a unilateral flow. It's a one-way street, ladies and gentlemen. So the narrative that when you get vaccinated, that it can alter, because it's RNA, it can alter your DNA, that means that the arrows would have to go in the opposite direction as well, which they do not. So this is why we believe that the vaccine is safe. We appreciate the God-given RNA technology, and let's carry on to address some more insecurities. But nonetheless, we're often asked about side effects, and the side effects are real. But let me just talk about 4 points as relates to side effects. These are the 7 most common side effects that people are experiencing. First, the first point is this. When you're injected with the vaccine, it's not until the second injection where most people experience side effects. So the second injection. Secondly, people who are 55 years old or older usually don't experience any side effects. So it's for 54 and younger who really experience the side effects. Third, I think it's very important, for you to realize that if you do get side effects, they will dissipate or disappear within 24 hours. And then the fourth point I want to make about this slide is having side effects is not a bad thing. What it demonstrates or is indicative of is your body mounting an immune response. It's indicative of your body, just like when you experience those symptoms or side effects when you have the flu or some other illness. That's what's happening. Your body's immune system is trying to fight it off. So when you experience these side effects most commonly post your second injection, it's a sign that your body is doing what it intended, the scientists intended for it to do. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because this has changed as of today to some degree. But this is, remember, we talked about the approval process, the FDA and then the ACIP committee of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And remember 1A, which most of us are transitioning out of right now across the country, but 1A had healthcare workers as well as residents of long-term care facilities. And then the ACIP recommended 1B being frontline essential workers and those over 75. At about 12:30 today, the Department of HHS then recommended or suggested to the states, because states have the flexibility, that we go down to 65 and above. And we also include people who have at least one comorbidity, 1 or 2 comorbidities, in addition to frontline essential workers. So your state may do something slightly different, but nonetheless, I just want you guys to pay attention to that and what the recommendations were and will probably remain to some degree for 1C. Remember, there are 4 phases in the rollout of the vaccine. Vaccine hesitancy and myths. So vaccine hesitancy, listen, on behalf of Trinity Health, let me let those out there who don't think that we acknowledge that the reality of hesitancy, and we completely understand why some communities would have this vaccine hesitancy. So I wanted to get that out there. But here's what I'll tell you. You know, when we flash back to the left lower quadrant of the slide, things like the Tuskegee Syphilis Institute or Henrietta Lacks when she was diagnosed with cervical cancer, and the misbehaviors that took place within the U.S. government, we get it. We completely understand. And that's why we have committed to listening to you, partnering with you to answer your questions, to address your concerns, and then making it easy for you not only to have access to information like we're doing today, but also to make it easy for you to have access to the vaccine. And the rumors, and this is not to discredit any of the rumors because, listen, you know, we all in some form or fashion have some degree of hesitancy, and rightfully so. But we would not be in front of you today if we did not think that these rumors are not true. We talked about how it doesn't give you COVID. We talked about how it does not and cannot change your DNA. We have no reason to believe at all that it causes infertility, it causes miscarriages, or that there's an implant of a microchip affiliated with this vaccine. So that's a picture of me back on December December 21st when I received my first Pfizer vaccine. And so I'm often asked, well, why were you vaccinated? Well, one, to protect myself, my family, the patients we care for, the colleagues that I work with, and all of you who are participating in today's conversation, to avoid an unnecessary, in my opinion, COVID-19 related hospitalization and death. I'm not trying to die right now, although I want to go to heaven. I don't want to die right now. And I don't have the opportunity to spend a lot of days in the hospital because we've got a lot of work to do here in Connecticut. I also wanted to help in the pandemic. I wanted us to return to some degree of normalcy. That means no masks, no social distancing, etc. And I also, as a leader, wanted to lead by example. But although I have been vaccinated, it doesn't mean that I can remove my mask. It doesn't mean that I can no longer social distance or avoid crowds. Because remember, herd immunity is the ultimate goal. And until the majority of the people in our country, on the planet, have immunity, which the safest way is through vaccination, then we've got to continue on the path that we're on now. As it relates to herd immunity, Dr. Fauci suggested that we won't see an impact of the vaccine until about half of this country or the globe has been vaccinated. But from a herd immunity perspective, he's suggesting numbers like 75 to 85% of us would need to be vaccinated. And what I'd like for you to do is just think about yourself and think about your family. If we all started from a personal perspective and expanded to our families and then to our places of worship and our neighborhoods and things of that nature, I have no doubt that we can get there in a short period of time if unified. So for me, it started with me getting my first vaccine or vaccination, and then it ended with me, and as far as this journey is concerned, on yesterday when I received my second vaccination. I'm not squinting because it was painful. It actually did not hurt. And by the way, I had absolutely no side effects after the first. Yesterday I had a mild headache, and I'm back at work today, and I'm doing just fine. So enough about me and my story. How about we turn it over to a good friend of mine and colleague, but more a friend than a colleague, Marielle, so she can share with us her story around her decision to get vaccinated.
Thank you, Reggie, mutual friend. So I just wanted to share my personal struggles with vaccine hesitancy because I think it was one that's important for people to understand. So initially, when I started to recognize that I was actually having this personal struggle, I said, what's wrong with me? I'm educated. I know I'm a person of color. I know I have a Hispanic origin, but I'm also an epidemiologist. I'm a health informaticist, and I understand the data associated with this science around COVID-19 in many different facets on many different levels. So I understand this information and truly know that this vaccine was developed with the best scientific guidance under the best scientific methodologies. But what I couldn't wrap my mind around, quite frankly, was that what was the source? Why was I so hesitant? Many of my friends, my family members kept coming to me with your opinion and asking, my nickname is Mimi. So they're like, Mimi, what are you going to do? I really didn't even know how to answer them for a very long time. So I would have to go back and say, what was the true issue that I was grappling with? What was the problem? What I didn't know until I addressed my source of hesitancy was really I had a barrier but it was my barrier to acceptance, and I had to go into my own journey, because until I had confronted the source and understood what was the source of hesitancy, I had to get real with myself. And what I didn't know at the time was the answer to my question was deeply rooted in past. Obviously, some of the things that Reggie just stated about our past, our pattern past, with healthcare, with a person being Black, and I had to acknowledge that it was my past lived experience of being a Black person in America. Not only that, from a healthcare perspective, I'm a registered nurse as well, and I knew there was some things that, from a healthcare perspective, that I had to deal with. So I understood the science. I understood that it's trusted based on my own and professional and educational experience. But what really started to come to me is that I had a good friend of mine who passed away, and we had to do a funeral by Zoom, which is that for anybody who's had some people that passed away around this time, it's very difficult. Not only accepting that someone passed away, but also trying to attend a funeral service by Zoom. And in that moment, in one of the many moments that I've had through this journey, I just knew that if we were to return to some level of normalcy, to some of the statements that Reggie has said already, and from a humanitarian perspective, I just said enough is enough. I wanted to be a part of the solution. And so I saw myself as being a part of the solution by getting vaccinated. But then I would also contribute to that concept of herd immunity that Reggie had gone through earlier in our discussion. I just wanted to be a part of that first step, the step towards my journey of acceptance. So just about 6 weeks ago, I finally made the decision to get vaccinated. And today, I received the first dose of the vaccination. So to Reggie's point in the beginning of this discussion, my personal story is not intended to sway you one way or another towards the vaccination. It's really just intended to provide insight into real areas of conflict, addressing a real issue, even with people with education, it doesn't even matter, scientists, non-scientists. I'm all of the above, and I still struggled with it. No matter where you are in your journey towards vaccination, my recommendation is to get real with yourself. Acknowledge what your source of hesitancy is. Make sure that you're informed in any decision that you make, and understand what those implications are for yourself and for your family and for your communities. And with that, that's the end of my story. So with that, I give this back to LaRonda.
Thank you, Muriel, and thank you, Dr. Edie, for sharing not only your personal stories, but really the facts and addressing many of the myths that are prevalent in communities of color. So we have lots of questions that we've been getting during Dr. Edie's segment. We've been getting them publicly and privately. So I'm going to just ask them in no particular order. For the questions that we received multiple similar questions, we group them. So these questions are both for Dr. Edie and Muriel. And the first question is, with AstraZeneca's efficacy percentage lower than the other two, but storage is easier, should we be concerned that marginalized and underserved communities are going to end up with AstraZeneca and potentially a less effective protection?
I'll be happy to change this. Yeah, I mean, ladies first. I don't want to hog the microphone, Mary. Do you want to go? You want me to take a?
No, you can go.
Sure.
I have a perspective, but you could definitely go first, Dr. Edie.
So that has to be a concern. I'm from Michigan. I now live in the state of Connecticut. And one of the things we made sure we did was when the governor put together his vaccine advisory group, we wanted to make sure we had representation from all aspects of the state, right? Science, subject matter experts, as well as people who are frontline essential workers, for example. I think we did a pretty good job on that. About 50% are female, about 50% minorities. And so now we had the sensitivity that needs to be taken to the table and injected to the conversation. So we have to be concerned about that. You must be concerned wherever you live, but there's a right way to do this. Because of the recommendations that came out today from HHS, I think it's less likely to just assume that AstraZeneca is going to be pushed to the brown and black communities. But that does not mean that some brown and black people won't get injected with the AstraZeneca. But remember, the efficacy on average is 70%. 2 full injections was in the 60s, 1/2, and then a second injection that was full was up to 90, and then on average it was 70. So I'm less concerned about that because remember, Dr. Fauci initially said, if we can just get a vaccine for this coronavirus that has an efficacy of 50%, we'll be okay. And we get that from all 3 of these vaccinations. So the one that's in front of you is the one that I advise you take as quickly as possible.
And this is Muriel. I completely support that perspective. And the other thing that people have to know is that we're going to have several vaccinations that are going to be available very shortly here. We also have Johnson & Johnson that's also around the corner. And to Dr. Edie's point, I mean, we should be more concerned about, taking what's in front of you. It's not about, if one is more effective than the other. Underserved communities are going to get this or that or the other. It's really just about getting the vaccinations in the arms.
Thank you both. Were any of the phases of vaccine development done in parallel rather than sequentially? Which was the reason the companies were able to get EU approval rather quickly?
Yeah, that is exactly the point I was trying to make. I probably didn't do a good job at that, so I apologize. But the only reason why they were able to produce this vaccine in a short period of time is exactly what the person who's asking the question is alluding to. Instead of doing these things in sequence or step by step or in series fashion, they did things in parallel. So they were in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 likely around the same time. And then the manufacturing, it usually takes about 15 months for a company to manufacture the right amount of vaccine. Because they were in the midst of a pandemic, let's say Pfizer and Moderna specifically, and you've got hundreds and thousands of people raising their hand every day saying, include me in the study, that means they had to massively produce the vaccine that they were injecting into people. And so they continued that on, and then by the time they got approval, they had enough vaccine, and you recall the news stories, to literally load on an airplane and deposit in a state, in one of the 50 states, almost literally overnight. And that's because they had done so much work in advance of the approval, and thankfully so, because imagine if on average it takes 6 years to produce a vaccine. Imagine how many of us would die before the 6-year mark when the vaccine was available if they did not do this so-called Operation Warp Speed.
Thank you, Dr. Edie. I'm sorry, Muriel, did you have a response?
Oh, no. I was just concurring with Dr. Edie.
Okay. We have another question. It says, I've already had COVID. Should I still get the vaccine?
Yeah, so my answer would be absolutely. A couple reasons why. One, we don't know how long the immunity, although we don't know how long the immunity from the vaccine is going to last either, we don't know how long your immunity, if you've had COVID, is going to last. That's one. Two, you also have heard about people who actually got infected a second time. So that suggests to some degree, for some of us, that your immunity doesn't last forever. And then third, in the face of the mutations or the variants that we're hearing about, like in the UK and South Africa, we're up against a race now. There's a contest between the virus mutating and us reaching herd immunity. So I suggest to everyone, so that you can guarantee, based on Pfizer and Moderna's data, not to need a hospitalization because the hospitals don't have the beds. And two, so that you won't die from COVID-19, we need to roll up as many sleeves as possible across the globe, get vaccinated so we can win the race against the virus and its mutations.
And that is one point of misinformation that I do want to reinforce of what Reggie was saying. There's a misinformation that when you get COVID that you have this immunity. What he said is absolutely correct, especially based on the science. We don't know how long the immunity is going to protect you. So the best way to ensure that the immunity is to get vaccinated.
We got lots of questions coming in. The question here deals with some of the myths. As many of us know, there was a viral video with a young woman of color who took the vaccine and had Bell's palsy. So the question is Bell's palsy no longer a side effect of the vaccine?
So Bell's palsy was never a side effect of the vaccine. And I apologize that someone misinformed you and led you to believe that it was. It would have been on my slide had it been. So here's what I say about Bell's palsy. First of all, about 40, I'm an emergency medicine physician. We would diagnose Bell's palsy just like we would diagnose a broken bone, way too often. About 40,000 diagnoses, if I remember correctly, of Bell's palsy occurs in this country every year. And at any given moment, so let's say currently, about 35 out of every 100,000 people in this country are living with Bell's palsy today. If it was secondary to the vaccine, what we would see, as you can imagine, is an increase in the prevalence or the rate of new onset Bell's palsy. And we didn't see that in this case, nor did we see it with anaphylactic reaction as well, because I know that's another common question. So suffice it to say that there's no evidence to suggest that Bell's palsy comes from the vaccine or an anaphylactic reaction is caused by origin from the vaccine, but instead, people who get Bell's palsy or have that reaction after the vaccination are no different from the general population, and it's just coincidental that they both happened in a short period of time. Would you agree with that, Marielle?
I do agree with that, and I know where some of this line of questioning is coming out. So with the Pfizer vaccine, there were people, just as Dr. Edie just was stating, there were people who were just a part of the population that was a part of the study population, and they got Bell's palsy, but there was then an association between the vaccination and Bell's palsy. So that's where the misinformation is coming through from that piece, to think that one is leading to another, but it's really it's almost more coincidental that those individuals happen to get Bell's palsy. There's no correlations to that, and the data supports that.
Yeah, thanks. And also recall the slide that we went over that talked about the approval process. That's exactly why that was in there. You know, when the subject matter experts, that advisory group that's a part of the Federal Drug Administration, you know they looked for that, right? Because the narratives had already been in existence. So when they combed through the data, had they seen that this leads to Bell's palsy, my guess is they would not have approved it. I'm pretty sure they would have not approved it, or if they did approve it, they would announce "Beware" warning, like on the back of a cigarette box. You know, this causes cancer, or this causes Bell's palsy.
Right.
In this case, and they did not do that, which is to Marielle's point. And we have to trust our scientists; they're the brightest on the planet. We have to trust the science, and the science is suggesting that is not a side effect, and there's no correlation.
Right.
So Dr. Edie, just sort of keeping in line with some of the side effects and what people are sharing as it relates to some of their concerns about or reservations about the vaccine is, it's around anaphylaxis and the result of the vaccine. Can you speak to that? And I think a question that we could couple with that is, no, let's keep those separate.
All right, so
this is about anaphylaxis.
Yeah, if it's okay, I'll get a bit personal. So I was a kid, grew up in the city of Detroit that had eczema, asthma, had every allergy you can think of, pets, shellfish, everything. And I had been as a kid hospitalized multiple times for what? An anaphylactic reaction. So I'm the adult who should carry an EpiPen everywhere he goes. Knowing that, when I went to get my vaccine, so if you agree or are going to get your vaccine, I suggest that you make sure that, and you ask this same question. When I sat in my chair before they injected me, and you saw both pictures, I asked the question, is there any Epi in the room? Because I have a history of anaphylactic reactions, and I want to make sure that, you know, because especially during my first injection, I wasn't sure of 100% of the ingredients. So it's a risk. I did not have an anaphylactic reaction. So that's after both of them. So that's my story. But again, just like the conversation with the Bell's palsy, the scientists have proven that there's actually no correlation between the coronavirus vaccine coming from Moderna and Pfizer, and those are the two that have been approved, and Bell's palsy or anaphylactic reactions.
Thank you, Dr. Edie. I want to combine this one. Someone is asking about, is it possible to transmit COVID-19 even after you've received the vaccine?
Maria, do you want to take that?
The answer is yes. And so And the reason, well, I'll just say the answer is yes. I was going to add more flavor, but that's it. Unless you want to add something, Reggie.
No, I was just going to reiterate something I said, and that's why until we reach herd immunity, exactly what Mariel said, we still must wear a mask and social distance. Because herd immunity, until we reach it, we must assume that people around us, whether they have been vaccinated or not, can transmit the virus. So those who have not been vaccinated, because either their time has not come or they refuse to, we have to continue to protect them until we get to that 80% number or whatever it ends up being.
And that's the other thing, Loranda, I wanted to reinforce really quickly. Even with those who decide to be vaccinated, it's still critical for us to maintain our public health principles of the physical distancing, the washing our hands, and masking. That's why it's still important to do that, because no matter what, even if you're vaccinated, you could also do something called asymptomatic spread. And so that's why we have to protect ourselves and we have to protect our community.
Someone asked, how long should I wait to get vaccinated if I've recently had a flu shot?
Yeah, great question. So I actually asked that question to a Pfizer representative because I'm on our state's advisory group on behalf of the governor. I had access to those people, and the recommendations, the last that I recall or that I was told was a 2-week period. So you should not take another vaccine either 2 weeks before or after receiving the coronavirus vaccine.
And so as a follow-up to that, Dr. Eden, I'm sorry, Muriel.
No, I'm just saying that was consistent with all the articles that I read in the same thing. It's consistent with the data to wait 2 weeks before or after.
And so just in line with that, if I was recently diagnosed or I actually just recently recovered from having COVID, how long should I wait before getting vaccinated after recovering from COVID?
Yeah, so that's a very common question, and I don't know that there's a great answer, but let me take a stab at it, and then Mariel, please chime in. So what we do know now that for those who maintain immunity, they've maintained it since the pandemic started. So let's just say, I think the literature says for 6 to 8 months, but it's not guaranteed that you maintain it. So unless you want to make sure that people who have not had the virus go before you, I would strongly recommend after you settle with that challenge, wherever you are with it, I would strongly recommend that you get back in line and you get vaccinated when your turn comes.
Completely concur.
Yeah, thank you. There's a question about what does efficacy mean in terms of vaccines? Does it mean that people don't get COVID or that the vaccine produced spike proteins as it should have?
Great question. You want to take that, Marielle? I mean, I talked about that. I may not have been able to be as clear for one to understand, so please.
So just understanding, what does efficacy mean? So when people hear the efficacy of the vaccine, what does that mean?
Go ahead, Reggie, since you could try it again.
All right, I'll try it again. If at first you don't succeed, try again. That's first grade.
That's right.
So it's a fancy word, efficacy, but just think about the other word that's a synonym to it, and that's how effective is the vaccine, right? So then you ask yourself, how do you measure efficacy? It has specifically to do, like if you looked in the dictionary and you looked up efficacy, it's going to say something like, how likely was it to reach the intended or desired goal? So therefore, as it relates to vaccines, when we give a percentage, so let's say Pfizer's 95% efficacy, that means out of every 100 people that's injected with the second dose of the Pfizer vaccine and wait a couple weeks, 95 out of 100, 95%, will have an immunity, which is the ultimate goal, right? We'll have an immunity to the coronavirus. That remaining 5% is kind of what you're baking into your question. They could still get coronavirus. So it doesn't have an efficacy of 100%. There's an efficacy of 95%. 5% can still get it, which is another reason why Marielle said we still have to wear a mask and social distance. Now, the good news, though, although the efficacy is not 100%, meaning it's not 100% effective for everyone, the good news is that what is 100% guaranteed is that you won't get so sick that you need to be hospitalized and you won't die. So from that perspective, it's very effective because we want to decrease morbidity and mortality, or sickness and death is what we want to decrease. And this is, we think, the right solution to get us there. as quickly as possible. Hopefully that we got that one right.
I'm sure you did a great job, Dr. Edie. I'm looking at the clock. It is 6:58. We're going to conclude our question and answer session here. There were lots of questions, but I think that with the time allotted, we were able to get to many of them. For those of you that are asking specific questions about your personal health, we would recommend that you contact your primary care physician and seek medical advice. Again, the purpose of today's webinar was to educate, to inform, to dispel myths, and to provide an opportunity for us to have access to ask some very difficult questions. So I want to give my thanks to Dr. Edie and Muriel for their time tonight. We are going to actually do one final poll before we close out tonight, because we're going to close out exactly at 7 in respect to your time. And so right now, the poll question should be popping up on your screen on the right-hand side. And what we're asking you is, based on what you know right now, how likely are you to get the COVID-19 vaccine? So we're going to leave that poll question up for about a minute. So based on what you know right now, how likely are you to get the COVID vaccine? I can tell you that at the beginning of this, also being in the medical field, I too shared quite a bit of hesitancy and for very personal reasons. And the longer I sit and understand the science behind the vaccine and the importance of people like me being vaccinated, right, that communities of color, we carry the brunt of the virus. And to be honest, we'll never achieve herd immunity without us being involved in the fight. So I am personally tired of watching the people that I care for be sick, hospitalized, and die. I am personally frustrated. All right, the poll has ended. Craig, can you pop up the results for us tonight? Thank you so much, everybody. It looks like as a result of tonight's webinar, at the very least, Dr. Edie and Muriel, we have provided enough information that I think some people that were right in the middle trying to make a decision, a personal decision around vaccination, have shifted a little bit towards very likely to be vaccinated. So again, we thank you so much for your time and attention, but mostly we want to thank each of you for taking the time out of your evening to be with us. This webinar was recorded, and we will share it with those who register and that we have correct email addresses. Craig, go to the last slide before we close. For more information, you can visit us at trinity-health.org. We have an amazing repository of resources for vaccine FAQs, tips, and resources, and how to find a Trinity Health location near you. Again, thank you so much for your time, your attention, and I pray that you are well, be safe, and have a great new year. Thank you so much.